all we see are stories at the peak of success, and we wonder, like, how do you even get there? It feels so unattainable. But you started your Instagram from like your first trip to Scotland and before you even pitched agents. And I've seen some of the conversations you've taken your audience on, and you're there connecting with people in the comments. I'm sure there's even more connections in the DMs, and being like a real person. Maybe you'll be that friend to many people who didn't have that access before in their life.
Yeah, I'm really excited by people reaching out and, who are on starting their journey. It's so exciting. I'm like, hey, here to support you. And I have done everything I can to support anyone who's written me in the DMs who wants to write a book or who is thinking about it.
I'm Joey Yongjan Liu, educator, researcher, storyteller, and coach. And this is Everyone Needs a Story for the Campfire. This podcast brings you impactful stories each week, drawn from my guests' lived experiences. You will gain inspiration, insight, new perspectives, and hopefully a sense of familiarity and belonging as we explore the themes that make us all at once uniquely individual, yet collectively human. This week I sit down with Kate STAHL-KOVELL. She's a Ph.D. Associate Marriage and Family Therapist who specializes in birth, pregnancy, and postpartum trauma. She's an activist, mother, and now a Romantasy Novelist. In this episode, Kate narrates her path to creating her first novel, More, and we discuss the theme of giving ourselves permission to be creative. Kate also shares her story of surviving trauma and channeling this experience of resilience into her service of others. Welcome back, everybody, to the Campfire. I am so excited to welcome my guest today, Dr. Kate STAHL-KOVELL. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I am so excited to talk to you today, Kate.
I am so excited to be here with you and to share the space with you. It's been a long time, hasn't it?
It's been a long time. And before we get into your stories, I'm going to share with the audience who you are, but let me give you the formal introduction first, or give my audience rather the formal introduction. You are a PhD, now an associate marriage and family therapist, right? Passionate about trauma-informed care and specializing in birth, pregnancy, and postpartum. You are an activist, a mother, one-time homeschool mother, possibly future homeschool mother again, but you're super hands-on with your kids. A one-time nomadic family as well. So many stories in that. And now a romantasy novelist. You are just like living the fullest life. And I can't wait to hear some of the snippets of your story here today at the Campfire.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. And it's this like really weird, vulnerable feeling that comes when someone reads your what's going on in your life. I'm like, oh yeah, it's a lot. I usually don't sit in that space of thinking about all the different hats I wear,
For sure. I think that's super relatable. And that feeling of like a mirror, like, whoa, that's my life. That's my story, but it is yours and you own it so well. And I just wanted to, before we get into your stories, talk about how we connected. We've actually known each other since we were 19. I think we're both the same age, right? We were both 19 years old when we embarked on our study abroad in Rome.
Yep, 2007.
Yeah.
Right?
2007. Yes. So we met on that study abroad trip, which was so life-changing. However, we didn't get a chance to connect all too much in that setting. You lived in an apartment. I lived in a homestay quite far away from the center of town. But we were kind of in some of the same classes together. And so even though we didn't get super close on that trip, I will say looking back, you and I had a lot of similarities. We were both really independent and both about having like the experience that we went to Rome to have. And even on spring break, I remember you traveled solo to go to Scotland, which we'll hear more about in today's episode. Not particularly that trip, but your connection to Scotland. I traveled to the UK and Wales by myself. And so we had some of those like similar vibes of just being free spirits and super independent. Yes. And then when we came back from that study abroad, there were so many sort of uncanny parallels to our journey that I got to observe through following you on social media and connecting at different points in our reunions and our book clubs that we had for with the group of friends from Rome. Yes. But you got married, had I think your son, your oldest is like a year or so older than mine, maybe a little older than that. But then we were pregnant with our second at the exact same time. I think we had almost the same due date with our second children. And we'll hear a little bit more about that story as well. And then you went on your journey to getting your master's, then your PhD. I then a few years later went on my journey to get my master's and my PhD, and then you've gone on since then to get more degrees.
Just can't stop, won't stop, apparently.
Exactly, a lifelong learner, nomad. Like you've just, to me, you represent the embodiment of live the story that you want to tell, and you just live so creatively, so fully, bringing your whole self, your whole family into it, and it's such an inspiration to see like every new chapter that you unfold and that you share with us that we get to follow along and see on your social media or when we get to connect like this. So I'm so excited and so grateful that you're bringing some of your stories to my audience today. It's just a joy to reconnect with you, Kate.
I feel exactly the same. I was just telling Dan, or I call him Mr. Kate on my, because he's an introvert and I want to respect his space as much as possible. I was telling him it's going to feel like coming home in a way, because I think that when you study abroad and when you travel internationally, you meet a new self, right?
Yes.
And when we were in Italy, we all kind of got to choose who we were going to be and which
Yes.
we got to take back home to the States. And so, in a really beautiful way, it's like coming home to my 2007, just lost my dad. I just had, is it okay to curse?
Yes.
Okay. I just had 0 fucks to give. And
that is you giving 0 fucks. Yes.
And I just was like, you got one life. I only had €30 a week on that trip. And I had like, I called them pane piccolo. There's actually a proper name for it, but like the little toasties for breakfast every morning. But I was there and I was living the life and doing what I needed to do. Yeah. So it's
Okay.
nice to come home to it.
Hold up. First of all, I have chills all over because I
What?
just found out like 3 different things that we connected on. One, the way that you described choosing who you wanted to be in that moment in life, like that is, I've said the exact same sentiment when I talk about traveling and
Yes.
coming into a new space and studying abroad. Like you get to invent your character. I mean, not in an inauthentic way, but there's so much freedom to explore corners and boundaries of yourself that sometimes your existing context back home or like in those spaces with people who've known you forever just feels too limiting to try out. So that the fact that you summed it up that way is so beautiful. It's such a beautiful connection. But hold up, this €30 a week budget,
Yeah.
I, in my group of friends who was closer to me in Rome, was famously known for trying to live off of a €20 a week budget and also eating those damn crackers for lunch every single day. And it was shout out to Peter.
Oh,
Peter was
yay.
shout out to Peter. One day we were at my little group was eating pizza and I was like pulling a plastic bag of these crackers out of my bag sitting at a restaurant because I wasn't going to pay for a meal.
Yeah.
And Peter like he was like, he slapped the table. He's like, Joey, I'm not going to eat another meal with you not eating pizza. Like we didn't come to Italy to sit here and watch you eat crackers or something to that effect. He's like, you have to live fuller. He's like, I will go withdraw money from my bank account right now so that you will eat a slice of pizza. Like we're in Rome, live it up or something. And
He's such a good guy.
yes, and like his generosity was not lost on me, but also this message of like life is short. This, is it really that important that I stick to my budget? Of course, like financial restraints are real. You and I guess share that in common. Like I paid my own way to experience that study abroad. But what I did in that moment was I was like, okay, I'm gonna eat pizza every day for the rest of the time I'm here. And if that means getting a job, I'm going to do that. So I went and started tutoring our professors' kids in Italian. I started teaching them beginning Italian so that I could have enough money to buy pizza and not eat crackers in front of my friends.
Oh, that's so smart.
Yeah.
How you? I had no idea that you were tutoring their kiddo. But, when you're in Italy, you can walk. A lot of places are free and you can have a good time. And that's what I did. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
There definitely was so much walking and so much freedom. It was such a beautiful time. So yes, I thank you for bringing me back to those memories as well. Coming home indeed. Okay. Are you ready to get into the stories that you've prepared so lovingly for the campfire today?
Yeah, I am. I'm really excited to share them.
I am so excited to hear them as well and for my audience to hear them. We're going to start with this first story, which reveals sort of the latest chapter in your life, a really exciting and inspiring one at that. And the theme that you'll surface in the story is giving yourself permission to create. And I'm sure it's such a vulnerable process, but you are doing such an inspiring job of digging into your artistry and your creativity and becoming a romantasy novelist. And I can't wait to hear the story of how that is unfolding for you.
Oh, well, I am so excited by the generous space to share it. If there's anything I love talking about, it's my book. I love talking about my book, which is called More. And I was looking at what I sent you about permission to create, and I feel like I didn't misspeak, but I feel like almost like permission to live in a way,
Ooh.
and
Yeah.
not is to live is to create, right? That's
Yes.
how we are human, is by creating.
Yes.
That's drawing. It doesn't necessarily have to be art, but and the ways in which we connect with people and we create relationship. And with More, it was just one moment in my life where I gave myself 100% permission
Mm.
to dedicate myself to a side of me that wasn't necessarily going to bring me any revenue. So no economic revenue. That didn't have like an immediate positive outcome, right? That it was just inherently for me to play with my imagination. And
Mm.
yeah, and so so permission to live. So when I started writing More, I was going through a pretty tough time with my family situation, my family of origin, as we say in the therapy world. My mom
Mm-hmm.
was passing of early onset Alzheimer's,
Mm-hmm.
and she had just moved a couple months prior into full-time clinical care out of state, quite a distance away, and was really struggling. And there wasn't much connection that I could have with her because she was struggling to speak with aphasia. And so even phone calls, be mostly talking to the nurses and whatnot. And so I was struggling because I wasn't her primary caregiver. My little sister dedicated her life to taking care of my mom quite diligently. So I was struggling with some, guilt over
Mm.
not being the person who was on scene, struggling with just losing my mom, and I'd already lost my dad, and
Yeah.
just had a lot of grief and sadness. And out came More from that. And
Mm.
I think what happened was I quit social media, and like we all do, I think I even posted a passionate thing about social media, as we all do. And I was like, goodbye. And then of course you come back at some point, because the dopamine rush is a real thing. And I quit. And then a few days later I had this dream, and I woke up, and I remember vividly exactly how I felt in that moment. And it was just like, I have to write the story that I just dreamed about. I felt like I knew the character, Berlin, who's my main character in my story. I could see her, I could feel her. I knew the ins and outs of her. I saw other characters. It was a very vivid, surreal dream that didn't feel like a dream. It felt like almost time walking in a way. And
Mm.
I remember turning and looking at Dan, and I think I smacked him. Like I went smack. And it's like, hey, not like across the face or anything like that, but smacked him, a gentle, lovingly partner kind of tap. And I was like, hey, I need you to watch the kids today. Is that okay? Because I need to write the story down. And I remember him looking at me and just going, okay, because I was going through an emotional rough time. So I think he was just kind of happy to see that I had something, right? Something to hold on to.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And when I started writing, instead of all those thoughts that tend to crop up when you start something new, right? You get imposter.
Mm.
Some people don't call it imposter syndrome because it can be a deeper thing, right? Anxiety, trauma. I had none of that. There was nothing there, because it was just like I'd already lost my father in a horrific way. I was losing my
Yeah.
mother, had already lost her, to Alzheimer's, but was losing her body and her beating heart. I was losing her. There's just no guarantees. And so none of that anxiety, none of what would normally come up with like a new project or a new job or something creative came up. And I just gave myself permission to write more, not really knowing what it would become. But I knew that I liked it. I didn't even want to read other work. And I'm a voracious reader. I'm a bibliophile. Like every book I have, I've read. Um, Except for a couple new ones lately. It's been hard to read since I've become a writer, because I really just like spending time in my story. And so
Yeah.
yeah, so that's where the permission to create and just the permission to embrace this side of myself came out. I think it
Mm.
came at first distracting myself, and then and then like a lifeline. Like if I'm not creating, then who am I, right?
Mm.
I'm not giving myself permission to be myself wholly. Um,
Mm.
fully. And I think some of it circles back to my work as a therapist. There's this thing in trauma therapy that we ask when my clients connect with your younger selves, which is, can you be there for your younger self with 100% of your being? No holds. Can you sit with this younger self who's experienced trauma and be with them, no sense of judgment? And I think for my book, I was able to be there for myself. It just feels like, like coming home to you, like I'm coming home to like my younger self. Um,
Mm.
and creating characters and using my imagination and delving into history and fantasy and folklore and folk tales. And I mean, that's what I've always been about. So it feels like coming home again in that kind of way.
Wow, that's beautiful. You touched on how this became something that emerged out of a moment of so much grief, and you connected the grief that you were experiencing in real time with losing your mom. I don't think that we talk enough about the different ways that grief can unfold, right? Especially when you're losing someone over a period of time. But you touched on that a little bit, and you connected it back as well to the grief that you had passed through and endured at a younger age, right before we went to Rome, and said that this sort of came to you fully formed as an opportunity for you to connect to something and connect with your younger self, even while moving through that grief. Can you speak more to what then did the grief look like as you started, like once you took that first day and started writing, and once you started doing all the things that you're saying where you just wanted to spend time in that world, how did the grief show up, and did it show up differently?
Well, to be perfectly frank, as someone who has a trauma history of a pretty intense trauma history, it definitely was a coping mechanism at first. It was a way
Mm-hmm.
to not fully feel my feelings. Um, Better coping mechanism than drinking alcohol or, doing something that causes self harm, right? But it definitely at first distracted me from the grief. And then I noticed when my mom passed, um, that sitting with my book kind of felt like spending time with her in a very strange way. In fact, the main character's mom, one of my readers read it and she happened to know my mom. And she was like, oh my gosh, she reminds me so much of your mom. And I was just,
Oh,
I know. And so I think that, um, when I spend time in that world, it is like I get to spend a little time with, a part of my mom. She's still definitely there. And I think, were you thinking about the grief in Italy as well after I lost my dad, or no?
yeah, if you want to speak to that, I just know that you had connected it when you started your story that you were losing your mom after you had already lost your
Yeah.
father to such a tragic way. Did it compound when you were going through this grief cycle with your mom as well?
Um, like compound, like thinking about my dad as well,
Yeah,
or
like did it resurface? Did you find that that was something else that you still had to heal from?
no, no, no. I'm so fortunate that I connected with an amazing trauma therapist after my son was born. So we've done.
Mm.
I mean, that's all cleared out. And the beautiful thing about like somatic body based trauma therapy, I sound like such a salesman, forgive me. But when you clear it out, it doesn't come back, And so I used to have, like serious trauma symptoms around that. But no, I think what I had to kind of go through, which is any kiddo who loses both parents, and if you don't have parents, caregivers, like the primary people like who raised you and sheltered you, when they leave this earth, there is like a feeling of, oh, I'm kind of alone. Like even if you have a beautiful family and supportive friends, it doesn't necessarily replace mom and dad or grandma or grandpa or whoever that person is. And so there definitely was kind of an alone feeling that I had, and spending time in more, I don't feel alone in any way, shape, or form. Like I feel, I don't know, they're all friends. They live in my head. I don't know. They're pretty real to me. And so, yeah, I hope I answered your question right. I feel like
You definitely, I think this is super insightful for so many folks. I'm I'm asking these questions because I think that there's a lot of opportunity for folks to just start to consider where they're at, and to hear this story can be like such a doorway or an entryway for people to start thinking about their own experiences.
yeah. I think, just to kind of cap this off, there's, this thing we call post-traumatic growth. And I think when I lost my mother, I didn't necessarily experience trauma. I was with her when she passed. But I mean, she had been in pain for so long that it really was very healing to see her shift to the other side. Um,
Mm,
but I think from losing both parents and not being involved in my family of origin system anymore, which I'm not in any way, shape, or form, it just gives you this permission to be yourself because I don't have the role anymore of who I was. Like my mom used to always say, "Oh, you really like beat your own drum." My dad
mm,
would say, like, "You're always outside the box," and it's like there's just not even a drum or a box anymore for me. And
wow.
I, yeah, I just get to be me,
Yeah.
and it's really freeing.
Yeah.
Um, but it took a while to get to that side of it.
Yes, yes, that's beautiful, and I'm sure that this is something that if anyone is curious or it feels resonant to you, there's a lot that we can do to unpack this and maybe like start that journey to understand what it means to really, as you say, like form a life outside of your family of origin. But I
Yes.
wanted to touch back on your story a little bit and how you said that the character reminds you and other readers who knew your mom of your mom. And so
Mhm.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about the creative experience. Did your main character, Berlin, did she like emerge fully formed with those characteristics, like almost like present herself to you? Or did you craft her in a way that was an homage to your mother? Was there some of both? What would you say?
So the character that reminds that reader and me of my mom is her mom. So
Oh, I
Berlin,
see. Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
Berlin's mom. Um, no, yeah, I can't imagine Berlin being like my mom, but no, Berlin definitely was fully formed. I wasn't able to really write her fully formed because I hadn't written fiction before. I had written a
Mm,
thesis, a dissertation. I mean, Joy, you know this. How many papers have we both written?
a
Tons and
lot.
tons of papers. It's not fiction writing. So this was my first experience really writing fiction. And so if you look at my first drafts, it's so funny. There's a lot of reels that say, your first draft is like throwing mud at a wall. I think actually Neil Gaiman said that. I might be misspeaking. I'm pretty sure it was Neil Gaiman. And that's definitely what I was doing. But no, I knew her. I knew her so well when I woke up. I think it was January 6th, 2022. I knew what made her tick. I knew, the spots she probably needs to grow in. I knew everything about her. I knew her heart so well.
Okay, so then can you speak to a little bit more about with your main character, Berlin? Were there similarities and differences that you found between yourself and her?
Oh, yes. And it's taken me some time to really think about this question and to formulate an answer to it. And I think that's because I don't want to say Berlin is definitely a part of myself on the page, but many characteristics that are Berlin's positives and negatives, and, the things that hold her back and the things that she gets to stand tall on. I draw from my own experience. But I feel like that denotes a lack of creativity to say, hey, my main character, yeah, I draw from my own life experience. But at the same time, I feel like I'm being a bit critical of myself. And like, of course, I draw from my own lived experience when I'm writing this first person uh, fantasy. I mean, how could you not?
Yeah.
She's definitely more quiet than I am. But I think that's because she's not around the people that she's meant to be around quite yet. And I feel like it's more comfortable to speak your truth when you're growing into yourself, when you're surrounded by people who, will be supportive. And the things I find that really resonate between her and I, we're both very tall, curvy people. We have a tendency to speak up even when it's not comfortable, especially um, around creating safety for vulnerable folks. We have a tendency to give a bit too much and
Mm-hmm.
to struggle with boundaries there. And as I was saying before, to be a truth teller. And she's also very nearsighted. And I am very nearsighted. And one thing that's been resonating with my readers is when they read it, can you imagine being nearsighted in the 500s, Joey? Right? It's not. And then there's like
What an
other world
experience.
creatures. There's like, um, oh gosh, there's like tons of these creatures that like will kill you in like really gruesome, horrific ways. And she can't really see far past her outstretched hand. And so a serious resonance is there that being an outsider inside of an insular community, that's a huge resonance. In the book, it takes place in the 500s, so what we would term the Iron Age. Some people call it the early Middle Ages, and it's based on the folklore from Orkney. And during that time, this is when Christianity started to come into the Isles. And where, if you know the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland, I think it was in 565, St. Columba banished the Loch Ness Monster. And so there's all like there's these stories of
Yeah.
Catholicism and Christianity coming to the Isles, and Berlin is a witch and her mother is a witch, and they're midwives and they're healers and they make herbs for the community. For me, when I think about Berlin as, myself, I'm a witchy person, and collect crystals and read tarot.
Yes.
And yeah,
Yes.
but being in a heavily religious community, it's mostly Christian, I think a lot of her experience, which we don't get much of it in book one, but more in books two and three, of having that pushback and that demonization of women in power. Uh,
Mm.
so that was me drawing from my experience, not just as, someone who is in touch with the old ways, but as a woman who has been in high achieving places. Um, and yeah. And so I think I wrote a lot of my story into her in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways
Mm.
you have several ways that were different. I mean, she's 19, so she's got a 19-year-old brain, and um, I mean, several different things about her. She's hetero and bisexual, and I'm trying to think what else. But other than that, I'm sure there are a lot of different differences, but I think a lot of her traits I pulled from my own life experience.
That answer is so insightful because I think for all of us who aren't fiction writers or have never become a novelist before, right? It was thank you for being so vulnerable and even speaking to the tension of feeling like, does this not represent my creativity to base so much on my story? But as you were unfolding this, and by the way, like the way you described your book, like I can't wait to get my hands on it.
A good one.
How you, yeah. um, but how you're weaving together historical stories, you're weaving together thematic stories that is pushing against like dominant narratives when you're talking about patriarchy, when you're
Yeah.
talking about the role of women and in really their gifts and their strengths and that being taken from them. And then you're talking about crafting a character who stands alone in her own personhood, who's not exactly you, but the truth that you're bringing to the story, even though it's fiction, how can you know that truth if it's not from your own lived experiences, whether it's through your lived experiences or the knowledge that you've absorbed, in your human life through research, through observation. And so what a beautiful synthesis of everything that makes up what you know and what you feel and putting it into this novel for your readers.
Yeah, it felt very healing to write it, and I don't think I was cognizant enough of how much her story resonated with my own journey, even though they
Mm.
are very different. And so I think it's something I'll continue unpacking for myself.
So awesome. I mean, and I hope before we move to the next story, my last question around this creative process, because it's such a new world for me, is can you walk us through more of the process? Like you're talking about this character building, you've talked about this early stage where it felt like just throwing mud against the wall. What where are you now on your journey? What have you learned about writing a novel, publishing? I know that you're documenting on your Instagram this journey of finding an agent, and I love the way you speak about I'm putting my manuscript out there, and I'm finding the agent who's looking for me. Can you
Yeah.
break down that story a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, when I first wrote more, I wasn't really sure what would happen with it, like who would read it. I was really writing it for myself, but I did call. I'm so lucky. I'm such an impetuous friend. I was like, "Hey, Meg Ellison, who is an award-winning author and is my friend," and I was like, "Hey, can you talk to me about how you publish a book?" Because like,
Mm-hmm.
know what I'm going to want to do with this. And I have a draft, and it was only 60,000 words at the time. And so anyone listening to this is probably laughing if you're in the writing world, because that's not a draft. It's at least 90K, between 90K and 130K, especially for a debut. And she was like, "Oh no, honey, like you have to write more, and you're not ready to query, and you're circle back once you have a draft. I'll read the first 50 pages, and then we'll go from there." And Meg, I think it's so key when you're coming into the community and wanting to be traditionally published that
Mm-hmm.
you have friends, that you have people you know, or you
Mm-hmm.
make friends. It's kind of like networking, but at the same time, it's not, because these are like they're your friends, like people that you trust to tell you the truth and to get you to a place that you want to be. So I started the querying journey this past January. I pitched, I would suggest like writers' conferences for anyone who's trying to get their book published so that you can meet with agents. Um, I love talking to people, and I mean, listening to people, that's my job as a therapist. And so going to these writers' conferences and having that contact with agents was really helpful. And then from January to now, I've sent out several full manuscripts, which has been really exciting. I haven't had an agent offer yet, and I'm really hoping there's one around the corner. But again, I emphasize this a lot on my Instagram. I really feel like the right agent is looking for me. And I just feel like, we haven't found each other yet. And I know we will. Because usually when people read my book, like people will say, like, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't put it down. I was sitting in the car at a family event because I couldn't I couldn't stop reading. And it's a good book. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like any book, needs some polishing, or, whatever, the agent and editor and I can work on together. So it's its most presentable self. But yes, I would say definitely, making friends with people who have published, so they can hold your hand. And then in return, you'll hold other new authors' hands when they go through their journey,
Mm-hmm.
and you just kind of pass that knowledge. I wish it wasn't so, it's not necessarily secretive, but it definitely is like a very steep learning curve, because I kind of just thought you call an agent and then you get an agent and then you publish, and that's about it. But no, it's what, Joey, it's strangely like academia. Dan and I
Mm-hmm.
were talking about this because, like, when you go to hire in for a tenure track job for academia, there's, the letter, the references, and then all of the questions like that they ask. And then there's the panel of people, and then there's the individual interviews. It's very similar in finding an
Mm-hmm.
agent. So about publishing, I don't know much about it yet because I haven't published yet. So, but for finding an agent, it is somewhat of an arduous process.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think that like even you sharing the piece of the chapter, the piece of the journey that you're in now to someone who's never looked into that at all, like we just it's a myth to us, just like we would think like, yeah, I want to write a book. Let me just find a website of who I can contact and say, here's a book I want to write. What do I do next, right? So I think it is really key to peeling back the curtain a little bit. And I want to sort of touch on two things that you mentioned. One, I'm going to start with I appreciate so much your belief in your own art and your own creation. And I would say it's not from this like ego, self-centered place, even though you started off and you said, I love this book. I love spending time with this book. And that is beautiful and honorable. And art should exist just because of what it creates for us, those experiences that it creates for us. But in addition to that, it's become this like collective experience where it's going out into the world and creating beautiful experiences for other people where they can get lost in your book. And that is worthy, right? So even though you are going on this traditional publishing journey and you're having to like wait for these certain milestones to hit and people to say yes to you, like I just want to mirror back to you your sense of unshakableness in the purpose for your art and your creation. And that is my wish and my hope for anyone that I work with, is that they can feel that way about their work, whatever their work is, whether it's serving people, helping people, educating people, or putting anything out there in the world. I would hope that we all have those roots in why this matters. So I wanted to just mirror that back to you first.
And we all deserve to feel that way. We all
For
deserve,
sure.
to feel like we are living our most authentic life, to the best of our capabilities, and, that the work that we're doing is good and
Yes.
without hangups about it. And not that it, we all need improvement.
Yes.
And one small story around that, real quick. One of my readers wrote me a few weeks ago, and she said she was having a really hard time. And she just heard this voice in her head. It was my main character, Berlin. And Berlin said, "Get up off your ass. It's all going to be okay." And I was like, she totally would say that. Like, that is exactly what she would say. And I had a little bit of like a laugh cry, because I was like,
Yeah.
oh, that my characters are sticking with people and inspiring
Yes.
them. Isn't that beautiful, Joey?
So
Like,
beautiful.
that's something I will brag about too. Like, that it's like, oh, that it's affecting people, that it's making them feel heard and seen. And
Mm-hmm.
I'd want my book to do it's to make anyone who, was a little bit too much growing up, a little too wild, didn't fit in, to just really feel seen when they read her story.
That is such a necessary mission, and it's happening. Like that would be fuel to my fire for sure. Of saying this needs to keep going out into the world. If it can do that, right? If these characters can live and breathe inspiration and instruction and whatever my reader needs, then it's worth sitting down every day for however many hours I need to sit down and get these words on paper and create this world that can connect to people's lives, right?
Yes, 100%.
So the other thing I wanted to touch on too is you mentioned that it's, this networking, or this like finding a friend in the community is so necessary to understand the steps that you take. And I'm asking for, on behalf of all the introverts out there, like if you don't just have a best-selling author in your close circle, where does one start?
Oh gosh, I know. I think about this a lot, because I am an extrovert, and it has been relatively easy for me to connect with people, because I love connecting with people. I love making friends with people I don't know. And I think another thing, it's a bit of a heavier topic, but to talk about capital, going to these writer conferences costs money. Pitching to agents costs money.
Wow.
And so, yes. And I really don't think that's talked about enough too. Right. So
Yeah, I had no idea.
yes. And it's not terribly expensive, but it's expensive enough that someone working minimum wage would not be able to afford it,
Mm-hmm.
And so I think about that a lot, how there are definite roadblocks, huge roadblocks put in place if you don't have capital, and if you aren't connected to the community. I think for connecting, going to a conference and meeting fellow writers and meeting fellow authors, other than that, connecting over Instagram. I've been very fortunate, just like, to DM an author and reach out to them and just tell them, I really enjoy their work. I'm on my own writing journey. Can you send some good vibes my way? And, that kind of thing. But for our introverted friends, I think, well, I have to think about this, Joy. This is a tough question, because I'm not an introvert. So I'm trying to put myself like in my husband's shoes. Well, he would lean on me. So
Every introvert needs an extrovert.
like,
Adopt an extrovert. Have an extrovert adopt you. I actually talked about in the episode with Dr. Charlotte. I was an introvert who was adopted, and she was sort of that door for me in academia. So maybe this is something that,
And I think there's more of an emphasis on authors doing their own hustle on social media now, from what several agents have told me, that like where never before that was an expectation. And I don't know if it's an expectation. Again, I'm so new to this industry, so I wouldn't want to say that. But from what several agents have told me, it is somewhat expected that when I make my little videos on Instagram, I love sharing updates about my work. I mean, it fills my cup. Like, it's not something
Yeah.
that's for me. So I think that, like, in this day and age, being an introvert and trying to break into the scene as a new author, I think it is probably more difficult than it used to be. Or maybe it's not, if they're not making reels and they're writing, right?
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought up your social media. It's such a place of inspiration. Excuse me. It's such a place of inspiration. And I would imagine that it's an opportunity for many introverts and people who are historically marginalized from having access to, like what you mentioned, these conferences. I wanted to say, like, I knew that traditional publishing was expensive in terms of actually getting a contract, and a lot of times the writers have to put money up front. I did not know that you had to actually pay a considerable amount of money just to pitch to an agent as well. And so
Yeah.
my hope is that with social media, shifting things in every industry, that it becomes an equalizer in some way, shape, or form for folks who haven't had access through the traditional doorways. And I see what you're doing in building your community on your Instagram page, and in many ways peeling back the curtain of just even talking about this process. Like I think so many people feel like, oh, I can't talk about it until I've landed the agent or landed the deal or whatever. And then, all we see are stories at the peak of success. And we wonder, like, how do you even get there? It feels so unattainable. But you started your Instagram from like your first trip to Scotland and before you even pitched agents. And I've seen some of the conversations you've taken your audience on, and you're there connecting with people in the comments. I'm sure there's even more connections in the DMs, and being like a real person. Maybe you'll be that friend to many people who didn't have that access before in their life.
Yeah, I'm really excited by people reaching out and, who are on starting their journey. It's so exciting. I'm like, hey, here to support you. And I have done everything I can to support anyone who's written me in the DMs who wants to write a book or who is thinking about it. But I've been thinking about this conferencing, and I think that maybe I've been to two writers conferences, but they've been ran by the same company. But maybe what we could do is help get established authors together and to have a fund set aside
Yes.
for folks from minoritized communities or who have real economic barriers, right? That don't need to like do not a lengthy application process, because that in itself is a barrier. But
Absolutely.
anyone who needs a little help, that we do have, like, each agent has 2 to 3 spots that's specifically for someone who couldn't pay, right? Or
Yes.
I think that's so important. And I thought
Yes.
at the first conference, it kind of left a bad taste in my mouth that, I mean, maybe the person running it already has something, but it's not advertised. I wonder about that, but to just make it a normal thing, to help equitize it in some way, shape, or form.
I love that you are thinking of that, and I can't wait to see what you do as you continue in this journey, because one thing about you is you're always thinking about others and trying to make space for others to come along with you and bring others up. So I just appreciate that vision and that mission so much, and I can't wait to see what happens as you continue on your journey. And I know that more is going to be in print and in the hands of many people soon, and it's going to be awesome. So we'll have to follow up when that happens.
I know, I'm really excited about it too. It's like there's not fear. It's just like it's
Yes.
a matter of when it's going to happen. And
Yeah.
oh, I can't wait. And at the same time, there's like some pretty detailed spicy scenes. So I'm also not excited because if my clients read it or if like an auntie reads it, I'm not looking forward to having that conversation with anyone. So um, that's one drawback to being a romance novelist is having folks read your spicy scenes. And they might think, well, where does that come from? It's like, no, no, no. We don't ask questions about this. We just accept it. We love it, and then we move on. Or you turn the page if you don't want to read it. Actually, I think
And
it's 10 pages long.
I'm sure you will become very well versed at navigating those moments, as you probably already have had to start doing so. But yes, I know that romantasy is like, it serves whatever role it serves for so many people, so many fans of the genre. And so you should feel super empowered to be whoever you are in real life and put those, fantasy worlds out there for whoever can benefit from them.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, we're gonna shift gears a little bit, and so maybe we need to take a deep breath because this vibe is gonna shift a little bit for us. We're gonna go from this theme of creating this permission to create and permission, as you said, to live authentically, and you'll probably find a way to connect this into the next story that you'll tell. But the theme here comes back a little bit to grief and trauma, and also how you pass through trauma, specifically in this story, your birth trauma, and how that became the motivation behind your service of others now, and how you're caring for others who are going through similar journeys now. So whenever you're ready, we would love to hear this story.
Yeah, I think that there's actually, I'm trying to think what was the word for this story? Let me see. It was resiliency, right? Yeah,
Resilience.
yeah, resilience. Um, I think there's a lot of connections between me becoming a romantasy author amidst all the other caps I was wearing and recovering from trauma to become a trauma therapist. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the permission to live. Like it's that permission to, you know, live life organically. Cause I think we're all raised, you know, in a certain way. Like, I don't know if like for folks, if they've taken that test in high school where it tells them like, you know, for aptitude, like what you might be good at.
The
Mine, it's like,
Myers-Briggs
yeah,
test. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there was a longer one. And I remember in senior year, or it was junior year, I believe, we took the test and mine said I had natural aptitude to be a researcher. And
Mm-hmm.
time, I mean, I was, you know, 16, 15, 16. I was like, what the heck does a researcher do? Like, I had no idea that I'd be getting a PhD someday. That was never on my radar. That's never something I ever thought I would do. So with the story of my birth trauma, I feel like, again, it's like coming full circle, stepping into who I was meant to be. And really, in a very strange way, thinking the trauma that I had, because if
Mm-hmm.
I had my birth trauma, then I wouldn't be able to hold that space as diligently as I do for the moms that I work with.
Right.
So to start the story off with my second born Bernard, around 32 weeks and 3 days, I developed severe preeclampsia. I think it's actually preterm severe preeclampsia because he was a preterm baby. And
Mm-hmm.
I had this feeling since I found out I was pregnant. I remember looking at the stick, and Bernie was in a planned pregnancy, and thinking I just started to, you know, work as an adjunct faculty member. I was getting into my groove of being a professor and wasn't really feeling like I was doing what I was meant to be doing, but I'd worked so hard to get where I was that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I could see myself stepping aside. And I had this feeling that either Bernie was going to die or I was going to die. And it was just very, or come near to death. And it was
Mm-hmm.
this very seated, not out of anxiety. It was just this kind of knowing that
Yeah.
something bad was going to happen. And so 32 weeks and 3 days, the day before Bernie was born, my face was quite swollen and hands were swollen, feet were swollen, but it was my kiddos finals at UCR. I call them kiddos, but they're adults. I probably shouldn't. My my adult students, it was their final, and or we were quite near to it, I think. And it was their final performance because I was teaching actual dancey dance. I usually taught history or English, so it was super fun to be able to work with the physicality of dance.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really concerned. I thought maybe I'm developing preeclampsia because I was writing my dissertation on pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, and had unfortunately read way too much information about preeclampsia and how it was like one of the leading causes of death,
Yeah.
especially in the US. And my midwife said to have someone drive me either to the hospital or to the birth center. And so I drove myself like from Riverside to Long Beach, and I went
Wow.
and got my nails done. And I had a garden burger. And by the time I got to my midwife, the midwife assistant checked my blood pressure and then tested the protein in my urine, and it was astronomically high, both
Okay.
like very high, like call 911 kind of high. You're going to have a seizure or stroke imminently. And
Mm.
so they said, hey, you need to go in an ambulance right now. But my mother in law, fortunately, lived a few minutes down the road. And so I called her and she picked me up and took me to Long Beach Memorial. So I was away from Dan and from my eldest. And the birth experience itself was very traumatizing because I knew that it wasn't going to end well.
Mm.
And I asked the surgeons, I had 2 surgeons working with me for a cesarean section, though I had a vaginal birth at the midwifery a few years before when I had my eldest. So I had what we would call a proven pelvis, and um, had proven that I could have a vaginal birth. So they very
Right.
much wanted to have a vaginal birth. And I believe, I don't know the exact research on this. I'm guessing there's an increase in risk when your blood pressure is very, very high. So they put me on magnesium. They said, let's just, like, he's going to be really tiny. Let's just try to push him out. About a little less than a day passed, and I just kept having a bad feeling. I got a shift change with a nurse. It's a very common story with so many people. Shift change, you had a great nurse, and then, some
Mm.
differences happened. The Pitocin was upped. And because, Pitocin aren't like, our, gosh, I don't like the word natural because I feel like it's so loaded. The physiologic, it's not our physiological way of pushing a baby out. And so it can be more painful, and it was very painful.
Yeah.
And though I had a vaginal birth without meds for me first, and that was a very long labor, 27 hours, 4 hours of pushing. So I'd already had like a pretty gnarly labor. I was in a lot of pain.
Hmm.
And so we tried an epidural. I had all sorts of bad feelings, and I wish I would have trusted my intuition here. I wish I would have pushed for a C-section. There's so many times when we face trauma, you go
Yeah.
back, I wish. But I was listening to medical advice, and during the epidural, which can happen, it's actually not uncommon. My blood pressure plummeted, and I felt like I was dying, and I didn't really feel like I was there anymore. And they couldn't find Bernie's heart rate. And so then, there's like a rush of, I don't know how many people. I was pushed to OR. The anesthesiologist wasn't answering their page. They tried again and again and again. They still couldn't find Bernie's heart rate. I wasn't steady. They weren't sure what was going on with me. And then the anesthesiologist came, and there's some trauma there because that he didn't believe me that I could still feel. So I had like a ring of bruises down my belly from him pinching me really hard. And I could feel each time he twisted my skin. And he said, you just need to be quiet and let the doctors do their work. And so I think birth trauma is so heavily under researched. There is more research. And I talk about this to my clients who have birth trauma.
Hmm.
The number one cause of birth trauma, as we see it now, as we know, research is fluid and it changes, is a patient not feeling heard,
Right.
not feeling
Right.
listened to. And it might surprise some people to hear that, like, oh, trauma is physical trauma, or, like direct assault on the body. And it's like, actually, in the case of birth trauma, what researchers have found, it's like, I wasn't heard. I
Yeah.
knew something was wrong. I knew something was
Yeah.
happening. And unfortunately, U.S. maternal health care still really carries that lengthy, grotesque history of treating women's bodies as vessels,
Yeah.
or the birthing bodies, right? Birthing bodies as vessels, vessels for babies instead of autonomous beings that we are. And so they were panicking because I couldn't hear Bernie's heart rate. And so I told them to just cut him out. And they started to cut, and I was screaming, and it was very gory. And
Mm.
um, my husband swears he doesn't have trauma from this. I'm like, how could you not? If someone was cutting into like several layers of skin and tissue and pulling out organs, and you could feel everything, like I would feel traumatized, like observing.
Observing the, yeah.
Yeah. And so like my C-section scar is really strange because there's a little divot because they had started and they stopped because, I was like, it's a different kind of scream. I feel like there's a scream that the body saves for when it thinks it's dying. It was like,
Yeah.
it was a very ghastly, like haunting, like war cry of a scream. And so they stopped, and then I yelled at them. I said, just cut him out, because at that
Yeah.
point I was so, so terribly worried about Bernie. I had already kind of decided I was dying. And so that was kind of set in stone. And then, so they did the surgery. And I remember watching the surgery from above. It's the strangest feeling. And I've read a few near-death experiences after, with my diagnosis of PTSD afterwards. I had some friends give me some books on near-death experiences that were really incredibly helpful to read, but I definitely felt like I was floating above my body and could kind of see everything that was happening and felt very peaceful. And I kind of felt shoved back in at some point. Uh,
Hmm.
but yeah, it was a really traumatizing experience. Like, we joke now, it's a coping mechanism. But have you seen Braveheart?
When I was a child, I haven't revisited that movie for so long.
Child, Joey, that is not a child friendly movie. I mean, I saw Jurassic Park. I feel like
That
our
gives you some insight into my childhood. I
okay,
was I was raised. Was I raised? No. Like, wow, it was a wild childhood.
so when they disembowel him and they're like pulling out organs and like you see intestines. So like we like say that I was disembabied. Like I wasn't disemboweled, but like I had a Braveheart-esque, like I didn't
That's a
have the
word.
I was disembabied. And then yeah, and so afterwards, like I didn't receive a PTSD diagnosis formally, but I was struggling with symptoms of, DSM-5 PTSD, which was flashbacks. I couldn't go anywhere where there were bright overhead lights. And that's a really common thing for folks who have birth trauma. You get a really high racing heart rate.
Hmm.
You're in medical settings, but my son was in the NICU for a month and I had to be in the NICU every day, trying with breastfeeding and caregiving for him. And then also, making friends with the other moms and community there. So yeah, I was definitely struggling with PTSD and then a cesarean section without working anesthesia, from, a provider who really shouldn't be an anesthesiologist. And if I could go back and sue him, I would. But
Hmm.
again, I was in such a vulnerable place living at the Ronald McDonald House and, caring for both of my kiddos as best as I could. I wasn't in a capacity then or even following to do that. So,
Yeah.
so that journey, led me to having a panic attack and going to ER and thinking that I was having pulmonary embolism, which can happen after a section.
Right.
And again, when you know too much, I think they say nurses and doctors make the worst patients. I think researchers do too.
Hmm.
You just kind of know too much of what can go wrong. And the doctor was like, hey, maybe you should try some meditation. And I had a therapist, but it was all talk therapy and I needed something different. So, back in the day, what extroverts who don't mind what people think of them did was post on Facebook to ask for help, which I would never do nowadays. But you're like, hey guys, I'm having symptoms of trauma. I'm struggling to breathe. Anyone have suggestions? And everyone had really great, wonderful, generous suggestions.
Hmm.
And my mentor, Dr. Raylene Phillips, who's a leading neonatologist in the Inland Empire in California, she said EMDR therapy. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't even know what it stood for. And I was like, if Dr. Raylene says EMDR, I'm going to go do me some EMDR. And I found my therapist, who also had a PhD, and I didn't have my PhD yet, but so she was familiar with academia and she did EMDR. And after that first session, I felt like I could breathe again. And it was just this, I can't even begin to explain what a gift it was. And I told Dan, I was like, I want to be a therapist. He's like, girl, he was like, you were just saying you wanted to be a midwife and an MD after your PhD. And he was like, you got to choose something, right? Because I don't think we have the capacity for massive amounts of like continual loan debt. And no, like I want to be a therapist because what she just gave me is, I didn't think it was something that you could give to someone without medication, right? Without a prescription. She gave me my life back because I entered that appointment not able to breathe because my system couldn't regulate because I was so traumatized. And well, I'm sorry, I went into the appointment with a dysregulated system and I left with one breathing technique that could get me into a grounded place. And she was my therapist for 7 years. She still can be my therapist, so I can call her anytime to process anything that comes up. And she practiced not just EMDR, but she was shifting into a model called Comprehensive Resource Model, it's CRM, which is a trauma based model. I call it kind of like hippie EMDR when I try to explain it to clients. And CRM saved my life. And it's all about repairing attachment disruptions and that example I gave earlier in the podcast of like, are you 100% there for yourself? It's learning, and taking out those parts of you that are very traumatized, loving them,
Mhm.
not telling them anything really, but holding space for them.
Yeah.
Feel the feelings that they didn't get to feel because they were so scared. Because they felt like, I mean, when your parents are disappointed in you, or any of that can be very traumatizing to a kiddo's nervous system. And so I wanted to do CRM, was very happy to go back. I was finishing my dissertation when I joined the MFT program.
Yeah.
And yeah, I told, my new colleagues, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to be doing trauma therapy work postpartum. And a bunch of them were like, well, you think that, but I was like, no, no, no. Like, that's like the only reason why I'm here. Like, it's like the only reason why I'm here is to give the gift that I was given. And then
Yeah.
for them to give it and for it to multiply. And my clients teach the breathing techniques to their kiddos.
Yeah.
And I just feel like the gift is just like really multiplying. The number of clients I've worked with, Joey, who their whole entire life their life changes.
Yes.
And I only get to see snippets of their life, but just the way in which they can hold space for themselves and others, it shifts completely. And it's just, um, I think it, I just say it's so hard to put it in words. It's like the most beautiful thing I've ever done. I love working on my book. I'd love to be a full-time author, but I don't think I would ever not be a therapist because it's
Mhm.
such a gift to give. It's such a necessary gift to give,
Mm.
um, especially with an extremely vulnerable population of, folks who are postpartum.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, I feel really lucky to have had the journey that I had and to be in the space that I'm in, because when my clients say, like, do you know what I mean? I do know what they mean. I do know
Mhm.
PTSD. I know what it means to have it. I know what it feels like. It's different for everyone, of course, but I think having that knowledge you don't need to have it to be a trauma therapist, of course, but
Mhm.
yeah, it's been very key to be able to hold that vulnerable, ethical, empathetic space for them.
Okay, thank you so much for this story. There's so much in it, and I want to touch on three things, but I want to start off with saying first, just appreciating your generosity in bringing us through that story so vividly and being such a testament to actually the healing that you've done to be in a safe place and a grounded place to speak this story. And I just want to acknowledge to my audience that it takes work to get there, to even be able to speak this story the way that you did. But I hope that the takeaway for so many people is the hope, right? The hope in that process that you can go through the experience that you went through, which is so traumatic and unfortunately way too common and
Yes.
systemic for some of the reasons that you touched on, way too common without the healing piece that you were able to experience. And so I'm just so proud of you and just so honored to sit in your presence, in the presence of your mission to bring that healing to so many more people and make it accessible for them. So I
Yes.
wanted to start there, and I wanted to say this is definitely a coming home. I knew from what you've shared of your story online that you had gone through this therapy journey. I don't know if you shared or if I didn't pick up on that it was EMDR. When you said that EMDR gave you your life back, like I'm having a visceral reaction. This is now the fourth podcast I think where it's popping up where I'm sharing that EMDR gave me my life back as well as a survivor of trauma. And so there's just something to this modality that is, I wish more people knew about.
There's this, again, I keep saying this, I think, because I'm a researcher. Research is always changing, right? Though the research is always shifting, what we know about trauma is that it gets stuck.
Stuck.
And they get stuck in the nervous system. I mean, I could
Yeah.
go on a lengthy neurobiological explanation,
Yeah.
but talking about it can actually make that trauma deeper in the system.
Yes.
And
Reinforced.
yes, and I also feel like there's this kind of ritual aspect to EMDR. Uh,
Yes.
I know there's so many healers worldwide, and I've heard, I'm trying to remember the name of this particular healer, but they were like, how do you heal someone by just talking to them? And I remember reading that, and I remember that really resonating with me, that
Yeah.
there needs to be some kind of ritual, some kind of connection with the body, right?
Hmm.
Connection, community, like there's healing in community. And so I feel like for any kind of trauma therapy, that's so important. And it's so good to hear that EMDR helped you, Joey. Isn't it beautiful?
It is beautiful. And I want to mention, because you're already sort of like setting the stage for it, you mentioned your connections to your EMDR therapist and certain aspects that felt representative to you and how she understood you. And I just want to shout out my EMDR therapist, who was a fellow Hapa woman, half Asian, half of European descent, who understood my story, who was also an academic, and had experiences with being neurodivergent as I am. So representation in these spaces of healing is also so powerful. And I want to shout out you too for surfacing how this modality also aligns with decolonizing frameworks and this indigenous and ancient wisdom of collective peoples, which unfortunately isn't present enough in the dominant narrative around healing and mental health. And I think that the people who need the most access to this to get through their trauma need people who understand this and who have lived experiences that represent, entry points and access points to them. So I just want to echo that back and appreciating your awareness of this and your amplifying these messages to the people who really need to hear them.
Yeah, I wish that like most of us were trained in trauma therapy clinicians. I think that it does bridge a lot of gaps that have always been there.
Yeah.
And there's like a really lengthy, interesting history of psychotherapy in general that enmeshes with racism, like anti-LGBTQ in a way. And so they're
Yeah.
just like with most medical professions in the US, right? There is a heavy history behind it.
Yes.
It's very charged. And I feel like trauma therapy, in a way, um, subverts some of that because it's
Yes.
about, not me therapizing the client and forming my own opinion from my worldview about what's going on for them, but it's them getting to step into their past. It's them, it's that autonomy that I'm not giving them, but the autonomy that I'm pointing out is already there. And then they get
Mm-hmm.
access and then take control of their own healing journey. And I think
Yeah.
that's what's so powerful about these more somatic minded modalities.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you putting words to that. I want to circle back a little bit to another element of your story. Do you feel comfortable with me asking questions about your story? Okay. So one of the things that I think that really lit up for me, because I am familiar with several stories of people who have been through birth trauma, and you named this piece of where the trauma lies in addition to what happened to you physically and to your body. But this first piece of not being heard and not being believed, and the to me, I see just the inaction of patriarchy, right? In a medical space where you're supposed to be protected, you're supposed to be cared for. It's supposed to be the space where you're receiving the utmost care and your life is being regarded. But you talked about this very dehumanizing experience of, I'm telling you what I'm experiencing in my body.
And
And
you're
as
not.
a woman and as a birthing human, you
Yes.
don't believe me, you don't even hear me. And this has been a common thread and a common piece of the trauma from the stories that I know of women who have gone through that. So I just wanted to ask you, you're working now with people who have experienced the trauma to heal from it. What would you say to women or to people who are birthing people, if they've never experienced the trauma, but they are anticipating giving birth or anticipating being in hospitals? What would you say to them in preparation to be in these spaces where we know that this is a systemic, um, systemic problem, a systemic thing that happens to so many people?
Stories are very powerful. And sometimes when you hear a story, especially when there's an aspect of trauma, it can sit in the psyche, right? And it
Mm.
can wreak havoc. But getting a doula, if that's possible, right? And I know that there are many doulas who have sliding scales. So
Hmm.
if money is an issue, I think some insurances, I was just reading this, I might be wrong. I feel like there's a movement for insurances to start picking up on doula care as well, which is amazing if
Yeah,
that's true.
necessary if that's happening. Yes.
So having an advocate, um, I would say going to a birthing class that focuses on your autonomy. So picking your birthing class, because again, kind of protecting your psyche and protecting
Hmm.
yourself. Um, really building what I call is a bubble. And I think actually a large aspect of this was taught to me in a hypnosis for birthing class. The hypnosis didn't work for me all, but, but very thankful for the course that taught me a lot about birth and about the mind. But you have this bubble around you that is flexible, and it lets in information that is good for you. But any information that is very scary or is very heavy, it just bounces that info back out, and you just let it go. So we're
Yes.
on visualizing your pregnancy bubble that protects you when you're young.
Yeah.
So the bubble, taking care of the stories you're listening to, telling people
Yes.
to stop. With my pregnant clients, when we talk about, they're like, "Oh, my aunt told me." I'm like, "Oh, how did that feel?" Right? It didn't feel great. Well, what would you want to do next time? And usually the client in some way, shape, or form comes around to, I'm going to tell them I don't want to hear it. Like, hey, if
Yes.
it's a negative story, no, thank you. Not right now. Informing yourself about the medical system in a way that isn't traumatizing. So,
Yes.
tons of books that I could recommend, and documentaries and such. Building a community of people who believe birth isn't a disease. It's
Yes.
interesting to say that when I had severe preeclampsia and had a near death experience, but it's truly not a disease. Things do go wrong, just like when you're driving a car. Sometimes things
Yes.
go wrong, right? But the body is not a machine. It is not something that's diseased. Birth is very normal. Physiologic birth is normal. And just reminding yourself that. I did this for both of my births. I had post-it notes everywhere with positive birth statements about having trust in my body and really trusting that everything would be okay. And then it's listening to your intuition, uh,
Yes.
honoring it. And if you don't trust yourself to be able to hold space for that, making sure your partner, if you have a partner or a trusted friend or your doula, will listen to you if you're feeling like something's going to go awry. And I'm a big proponent of midwives.
Yes.
Love midwifery care. And I've never felt more cared for than in my midwife's arms. There's something about a midwife. Midwives, are the original healers. Berlin is
Yes.
a wife. She's, because because Berlin is a witch. And back in the day, I mean, witches still are midwives, but a witch was to be a healer, was to be a bringer of life. And so midwifery care, I feel like your autonomy is, you have a better chance at having your autonomy respected.
Yes. Those are all such powerful suggestions. And I think the show notes for this show will be full of resources. I'd love if you can send over any of the resources that you think will be helpful to the audience. So we'll link everything below. And I'm with you. I'm a big proponent of midwifery, and I'm very fortunate that I got to birth both of my children with a midwife. I love this suggestion that you made to the audience about being intentional about the stories that you are consuming and that you're spending time with in each stage of your life. So particularly if you're embarking on a birth journey, there are so many beautiful, empowering stories about birth, and there's a fine balance where your intuition can guide you in being informed about how to protect yourself and what could go wrong, but not being consumed in the fear of that, and then balancing that with these powerful stories of beautiful possibility and normalcy in birth.
Yes.
And I know that was really a positive guiding light for me in my birth story, and I would wish that for every single person. And I
Yeah.
also wanted to say, so powerful again that you have transformed this traumatic experience for you into something that is such a platform for advocacy. And it can really happen to anybody. Unfortunately, it can happen to anybody. But I did want to touch on that. We know the research shows, the statistics show that it happens, unfortunately, statistically disproportionate to Black, Brown, and Indigenous women. And so all of this education that's going out there, and there are so many amazing midwives and doulas and organizations that are fighting for people to stay alive while they're giving birth in the hospital, especially these marginalized communities. But there needs to be even more, I think, awareness. So my hope is that all of this information goes out there to empower people's choices. And I really appreciate and acknowledge you bringing this story to the campfire today to our audience.
Of course. It has been such a pleasure to bring it. And just to echo what you were saying, the research is so clear that for people of color, that birth is very dangerous in the
Yeah.
US, particularly. And so having culturally aligned maternal health care is, I think, vital to safety, right?
Yeah.
Um, so whether that be in the form of a doula, a midwife, doctor, but just having people in your corner who are in some way, shape, or form related to your lived experience, it
Yes.
can help create safety.
Thank you for that. And we are going to wrap up this episode with you reflecting in that same spirit, reflecting on this theme of this season of the power of stories that reach. And I think we've caught a glimpse of that here in your stories. But can you share with the audience what it means to you to put your stories out in a public way and have them reach strangers and audiences and impact their lives?
What it means, gosh, I don't know. It's like surreal. Like I wish I had a more intelligent way to say this, but I feel like it's so joyful to me because I'm putting a piece of my heart and my brain on pages, and for people to come away with feeling inspired by it, and even just generally loving it. It's kind of like in kindergarten when you get to bring a stuffy to show and tell, and everyone's like, that stuffy's so cool. You're like, I knew I liked my stuffy, right? I believed in my stuffy, so I brought it to show and tell. And now I'm getting that positive feedback. It's honestly, it feels like living a dream. And if it feels that way now before I'm agented, I can't imagine what it will feel like once I'm agented, once I'm published, once my book has reached 1,000 people, 10,000 people. I'm already sitting in gratitude. And
Mm.
I think I'm just going to basically just sink into gratitude like it's one big lovable beanbag chair, because it is just, I don't know, it's an amazing feeling. I can't describe it any other way.
Wow. I mean, that was so visceral how you described it. And so if anyone's on the fence about putting themselves out there and doing that creative thing or
Yeah.
that vulnerable thing, I think you're really selling folks on it of what it could feel like, because that just sounded lovely. Well, can you share with us where the audience can find you, can find more, can find anything that you're working on and putting out into the world?
Sure. I think I need to build a website at some point, but on Instagram, I'm Kate Writes It, WRITESIT, and it's a public Instagram, so you can follow me there. If you're listening to this podcast and you want to chat, please don't hesitate to DM me, and I'll get back to you when I have some time. And then for postpartum care or pregnancy care, I'm seeing clients virtually in California and in person in Redlands, California. And it is an LGBTQ plus aligned clinic that I'm working at. It's amazing. I love working there. They take diversity, equity, inclusion quite seriously, and it's a joy to work there as a trauma therapist. So you can reach me though on my Instagram, postpartum PTSD. I haven't tried to build a following there in any way, shape, or form. I think the last time I posted was a couple years ago, or my Psychology Today listing under my full name.
And we'll make sure everything is linked in the show notes so that anybody who's hearing this episode and feels aligned with Kate and wants to get in touch with her, will make it easy for you. You're doing amazing work. I am excited to keep following your story and journey and to chat with you next time, wherever your story is unfolding and whatever turn it's taking. I can't wait to catch up with you next time. Thank you so much for being here and bringing your stories to the table, to the campfire. Thank you so much for bringing your stories to the campfire here today. It's been an absolute joy.
I am so thankful to be here and to have spent this time with you. Thank you, Joey.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you for being here for another episode. We can't wait to bring more stories to your ears next time here at Everybody Needs a Story for the Campfire. Bye. Kate is such an inspirational example of thoughtfulness, intention, and advocacy, from her work in therapy to her creation of worlds and empowering characters on the page. I will be eagerly awaiting the release of more, as I know so many others are too. You want to stay connected with Kate? I've linked her websites below. I'll see you next time here at the campfire with more stories, insights, and shared exploration of what it means to be a human.